Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here with us. Looking forward to our show. You know, recently I was looking at some information that called into question that does gender identity law spell the end of religious liberty in the state of Minnesota? You know, recently the Minnesota legislature and governor added a new category of so-called human rights called gender identity to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. They included no corresponding religious exemption, however, demonstrating their intent to deny religious freedom to the citizens of Minnesota, to churches, to schools, and to engage potentially in what some would view as being persecuting Christians and some other religious bodies. You know, Melissa, you're somebody who has an opportunity to work not only at the federal level as it relates to laws and making sure that it has carve-outs for religious groups. And I also know that you spend a fair amount of time looking at what happens at the state level, because generally what happens at the state level will find itself probably morphing into being federal law to some degree. When you saw this particular piece of legislation, were you kind of surprised? And what do you think this was all about? And what is the backstory or even the background on this?
Sure. Well, I was surprised, but I don't think I was the only one. So it was really interesting. So in the summer of 2022, as you said, or in the legislative session, the Minnesota legislation decided to update their Human Rights Act. And as you mentioned, by updating the definitions of some of the terms. So previously, gender identity and sexual orientation were all under one definition. And so all they were really doing is just sort of some housekeeping of splitting the two different categories, gender identity and sexual orientation. Well, so religious protections already existed, or religious exemptions already existed in the original version of the Human Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And so when that update took place, that religious exemption was included under sexual orientation. It was not under gender identity. Now, Republican lawmakers there in Minnesota were like, it took a couple of months after the passage for people to realize what had actually taken place. And so they reached out to their Democratic colleagues and said, hey, you know, there was this oversight in the language. Here's a quick fix to just make things like they were before. And that's when the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which has the large majority there in Minnesota, said, no, we meant to do that. And then, unfortunately, a lot of very contentious, passionate, I would even say angry, very heated debates took place in these committee hearings. And so that is what took place last year. This year, we, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, were actually a part of a coalition of religious organizations, a real diverse coalition, led, I think, in part by the Catholic Church there in Minnesota, the Minnesota Catholic Conference. And again, just making this suggestion, requesting this amendment that would include the religious exemption for gender identity. And again, that was quite an uphill battle, and didn't feel like we were getting any sort of headway with the conversations that we were having with lawmakers. And then all of a sudden, I think they realized that, this religious exemption is actually included. It's part of existing protections in both federal and state constitutions. And so very quickly, the bill that was introduced that was reinstating the religious exemption was passed unanimously in the Senate and then signed into law by the governor there. But it was very interesting because, again, the governor, who is, again, a Democrat, said that, oh, this actually was just clarifying rather than new legislation. So a really crazy situation.
You know, what I find so interesting about this situation is that it seems like they're trying to pit, religious protections, religious liberty protections against LGBTQ rights. And it doesn't have to be like that. I think we can all agree that all humans are entitled to, human dignity and certain civil rights being protected. But the issue here is that as religious organizations, we have to be able to have the ability to choose employees who adhere to our religious beliefs and tenets. Otherwise, the government is interfering with our ability to, freely exercise our religious beliefs. And I see that as the issue here.
And Jennifer, the other thing that grows out from here, and this is what concerns me, the far right and the far left love to seize on moments like these and take the discussion and pull it so far out of what, any rational conversation could be had concerning it, that where we're supposed to be going all gets lost sight of. And it's moments like these where, you start to long for the days when we were largely governed by a moderate, whether it was moderate Republicans or moderate Democrats, who understood that we live in a very diverse country. And the far right has no greater claim than the far left does when it comes to establishing principles and laws that work for all of us. And long after, the dust has settled, there will be groups conveniently leaving out the important parts of this discussion. And the lone element that they will seize on is, look, see, this is what I'm talking about. This is why you can't put these people in charge. And I take issue with that, whether it's the right doing it or whether it's the left doing it. Both instances are reprehensible and not what good government is supposed to be about.
You know what, Todd, but it sounds like what Lawrence just described is where politics is today. It's about clicks. It's about trying to find people who would come in and listen to you if you don't say something that's outrageous or creating something outrageous, no one gets to know what your name is or what you stand for. The reality is that this is the game. How do I play it in a way where I get attention for myself? And it's not even about whether or not sometimes we're doing what's in the best interest. Or, Todd, you've seen a lot of these things in a lot of different scenarios. I mean, has this been what you've been seeing going on?
Yeah, I'm not the first to have said this, but we're living in a Puritan time of American history. It's different issues, right? I mean, it's not the same as the actual Puritans were experiencing, but a time in which you see extreme ideological views, you see no dissent or incongruity, no one who takes, anything less than the maximalist position of whatever side they happen to be on, and that is viewed as being heretical, as being even worse, than a person who they disagree with, right? That you must be pure in thought and act. And, picking up on what Jennifer said, it's not just a matter of the religious organization have the freedom. At the end of the day, all religious organizations are just a collection of individuals. And so, don't parents have the right to send their kid to a school that reflects their religious beliefs and teachings, and who it hires, who it has the students, how they behave? And the Supreme Court has definitely said you have the right to send your kid to a private school. But what good is that right if the state can just turn that private school into having all the same teachings, beliefs, environment as a public school? And so, fortunately, the state of Minnesota, they did wake up at one thing. There were some interesting political actions that go on there dealing with, believe it or not, stolen ashes by a member of the Senate, right? And so that created some interesting dynamics there. But even though this problem got solved, it's not going to be the last time we see this. And, the pendulum in America swings from time to time. Hopefully we get back to a time that, Lawrence mentioned, where we're a little bit more moderate and not in such a tyrannical time.
I was just going to say how much I appreciate my colleagues that work in this space first of all, that alerted us to the situation that was going on. As you mentioned, we primarily work on federal legislation, and it just simply was not on our radar. And so I really appreciate that we have colleagues that we have established relationship with that reach out and let us know. And again, I also really appreciate the diversity of voices and their willingness to engage on this issue. And so it was, as Todd said, he and I were involved in, 3 months of this, and it went all the way from one extreme as far as we will not accommodate you, and our counter as far as potential amended language is to actually remove the exemption from sexual orientation, rather to sort of quote unquote make things worse or go even further, to all the way. Then at the end of the legislative session, the Senate unanimously approving the revised language. So it just really is a whirlwind. And I guess I've never worked in state legislation, but my understanding is that's kind of how it goes a lot of the time.
Another thing that concerns me is if we allow the political spectrum to be boiled down and to be dumbed down to the point that people feel they only have two choices, either this extreme or that extreme, then what begins to happen is a lot of things that should be considered get thrown out, and it comes down to what do I hate the most and what do I like the most, and it never was meant to operate that way, but it seems that's where we're trying to get to, and once it gets to that point, all bets are off.
The good thing in this case is that reasonableness won out, right? There may have been extremes on both ends in the beginning, but because of advocacy efforts, because people just started having discussions and having dialogue, in the end, it looks like that won out, and hopefully that continues, right? We don't let the extremes dictate legislation, that we are in a place of moderation so that all voices can at least be heard.
Todd, you've been doing this for a while, and it seems to me that we're starting to see more of the battle for religious protections is turning into a real team sport. It seemed like for a long time, people wanted to try to see if they could go the roads by themselves. But now, you hear a lot more about coalitions that are working, groups of religious groups that realize it together. I mean, has this been your experience? And is this where you think it's going to continue to go?
Yeah, I mean, this started in the 90s, with people like Seamus and so forth, putting together, religious liberty advocacy groups and firms. But yes, as religious liberty has come more and more under attack, organizations are realizing now that they need each other and have to work together to be heard. And that, even though they can maintain their separate religious identity, working together on common issues of religious liberty doesn't compromise those beliefs in any way.
Well, I think I'm going to let that be the last word, but I think the real powerful aspect of this is understanding that, if we can strive to find what I would call more of a central location or a middle ground, then we end up helping a lot more people. I think the point has really been made that the extreme left or the extreme right sounds good in theory and maybe even feels good, during a primary election. But in terms of being the center of running a country or a particular state, it has no place in our society. The Supreme Court reaffirmed religious liberty in Canada, but surprisingly, it looked like that religious liberty in Canada may not include Quebec. In a Supreme Court decision in Canada last week, they left standing what somewhat surprising result in that, namely that secular authorities must accommodate religious practice. We've been accustomed over many decades to really just the opposite. Religious believers are the ones who have to accommodate those who object to religion in the public square. Sometimes when you look at what goes on in Canada as opposed to what goes on in the United States, the thought process is that because you're just so, quote unquote, closely aligned from a geographic standpoint, that maybe we are also closely aligned from a religious liberty standpoint. Todd, as somebody who actually has worked on a worldwide basis, and even in the work that you've done in the North American division, which also includes Canada, when you see this type of result, is it a little bit surprising, or is it something that basically what happens in somebody else's backyard can easily start creeping into your backyard?
So, well, just first of all, Orland, not to just to be fair to our Canadian friends, this came out of Calgary, which is in Alberta, which the Quebecers and the Albertans would want to make sure they are very different. But yeah, this situation where you had a school that wanted to be non-denominational, wanted to basically be secular, and objected to having to provide religious spaces for Muslims during the school day, Muslim students. What was most disturbing about the Supreme Court's decision there wasn't just saying, listen, you're a secular organization, you don't really have religious objections to this. They were like, yeah, this doesn't really interfere with your rights. This isn't the big deal. Like, it's not up to courts and should not be up to courts to weigh, what an organization and the type of environment it wants to be and whether or not this does interfere with their rights. If this was a public school, then absolutely it has to be open. But the challenge is certainly trying to make a distinction between a non-denominational school and, say, a religious school that doesn't want other, sort of almost competing religions, being accommodated there because they're trying to create a particular environment, say a Catholic environment or Adventist environment, I think set the Court of Appeals sort of on a dangerous road. What the reassuring portion of me here is, because the schools seem to be so non-denominational, because they didn't really seem to have a religious objection to this, they just kind of wanted to shove all religion out. I think, the courts might have just said, listen, you seem like more like a public entity here, and sort of ruled against them on that basis. But yeah, taking this sort of position and this analysis and this viewpoint to its logical extension would cause problems for people of faith.
Well, here's what's interesting about this case, though. The school wasn't just trying to slap a non-denominational title on itself. They actually were working to create an environment that, yes, was very diverse and that incorporated groups from across the spectrum. And in calling it non-denominational, what they were trying to do was have this setting, this place, this school, where all of these different groups are coming in and, in essence, create I don't know if you want to call it a safe space for everybody, but the goal was to not have anybody's belief system infringe on anybody else. And so it was not accidental that you had these diverse groups there. That's the look they were going for. But when two Muslim students objected to not being able to have carved out time to do their prayers, in fact, they were both Sunni Muslims. And when they were denied the opportunity to have this accommodation, the parents took issue with it and took it to court. And interestingly enough, this whole process dragged out over the space of about 12 years or something like that. And the school ended up spending a lot of money in legal fees. Their goal was very simple. They wanted to be able to maintain the look that they were going for in the first place. And here's another curious thing that grew out of all of this. Obviously, the school lost at every level, but outside of the two Muslim students that kicked up a fuss over the entire 12-year period, that was it. And so I found it curious that something that played out over such a long period of time, in one sense, never really turned into the big conflagration that perhaps some thought it might have, because outside of these two students, that was it.
First of all, I think my understanding of what non-denominational means, or my assumption versus secular, because I kept being confused by the fact that we were referring to non-denominational, which I think typically means doesn't have a specific religious origin, but
Right.
has some sort of religious connotation. Instead, this was more of like a secular. Maybe this is a Canadian versus American thing. I don't know. But that said, it seemed like to me a very easy accommodation to make. Certainly one that I wouldn't spend $1 million not doing if I was the school in several years. They literally wanted a space to be able, away from everybody else. I love what Lawrence said, to be able to pray a couple times a day. And I don't understand why they fought this tooth and nail. I love what Lawrence said as far as they wanted the look. They were very deliberate. I think they wanted the look of diversity, but they didn't actually want the Muslim kids to be Muslim, right? They didn't want them to act that way, to actually, pray or anything like that. And so I'm glad that things went the way they did. But man, I can't imagine that was a worthwhile amount of money that school spent on this.
Yeah, I shared your same confusion, Melissa, regarding the non-denominational versus secular, right? Because even in the argument, it was, well, allowing the prayer space could threaten the secular environment. And so I'm like, well, which is it? And they went so far as, we don't even want you to have the appearance of praying. Like, you can't kneel or show that you're even praying in any sense. And so it seemed like it was almost the singling out of these Muslim students, to give the appearance that they're even doing anything religious on campus at all. And, to have a $26,000 fine and spend $1 million and go through all these steps for 12 years, it seemed like it was a very big deal to this school, maybe for some, principle that they're trying to uphold, again, of having the secular nature and not having any appearance of religion at all on campus. It was a long battle that they were not successful in.
Well, Todd, what I found really strange is it looked like what they were hoping to do was to be as wide open as they could be. And as soon as it got wide open, they realized, oh no, we really want this a whole lot more restrictive. It's almost like they couldn't figure out, do I want to be open or do I want to be closed? But when they saw what open looked like, they were like, oh, let's start closing in on this.
No, it was, even though this was in Calgary, it was sort of a very sort of French approach to it. I don't mean Quebec, but I mean France, where it's this laissez-faire, right? This idea that we're going to be a secular country, that outside displays of religion are inappropriate. Like, you can have your cathedral, you can go to church there, maybe a mosque, but you keep that sort of in private space. And it seems to be what they were going for. But that really doesn't meet the definition of open. And France has been very criticized for the way it's treated its minorities. It does have a unique set of issues there with, Muslims killing and attacking teachers in the classroom. And so I think they feel some certain constraints there. But yeah, they couldn't figure out what they were. And I think the confusion, and by the way, before I sort of delved into this, I had the same thing. I was like, well, what's the objection if they're non-denominational to having Muslims, right? I think the fact that we were confused probably meant the judges had some also, they understood it, but they probably also were like, what are you doing? And I could see that impacting the decision. So, like I said, my main concern with this is how much does this get cited and this sort of analysis used in the future? But I think it came across mainly as, somebody that was trying to just go after, a couple of Muslim students. Because the reality is, presuming that most of their students, as far as religious, were either Jewish or Christian, there's not a lot of outside, clothing or articles of faith, right? It would be interesting if there were Jewish kids attending, if they would, have a problem with the yarmulke. Christian kids, could like a Christian boy or girl wear a cross? Was that prohibited as well? But all of those are a whole lot, first of all, less central to the faith on the Christian side, right? And don't necessarily have to be displayed publicly, like a yarmulke would, or, hijab.
This reminds me of some years ago when I got the bright idea that I'm going to put a saltwater fish tank together. And without doing any homework, I just had this bright idea. I'm going to get these fish and dump them in there. And because no thought went into the process, I ended up with a saltwater tank full of fish that didn't get along. And at some point, I had to say to myself, you know what? This willy-nilly fly by the seat of your pants approach probably is not the best way to go. And you probably won't end up with something that really works here. The fish, the ones that didn't kill each other or didn't jump out of the tank because they were being forced to live with fish that were trying to eat them. Yeah, so let's just say that the tank ended up empty and sitting in the shed for a long time.
But Todd, I got to ask you, is part of the confusion here because there's a little bit of a difference between how the government engages in funding education in Canada than it may be here in the United States. Government funding being part of, their, funding mechanism is pretty commonplace. And maybe that in and of itself is what causes a government or even a judicial body to feel that they should have a little bit more of a heavy hand in the process.
Yes, the public-private distinction that we really make in the United States is not as widely accepted in Europe or in Canada. Essentially, all of society is a public space. We've got to regulate all of it. Listen, to some extent, every society does that, right? Like, a church is regulated. You must meet fire code. You must meet certain safety standards. We're not going to let the thing, fall down on people. But it's where on that line that you land. And certainly more, quote, traditionally liberal countries, have certainly are much more comfortable, regulating those spaces, telling people what to do. And yes, the financial contribution to it certainly encourages that kind of thinking and behavior.
Well, I think when you see this type of activity taking place, Lawrence, the only thing that we can really hope to do is to try to be as informative as we can to the public, because if you can inform the public, maybe there's a possibility that even the rest of society, the legislature and the court systems may get it more.
And therein lies the rub, because today misinformation is a whole industry in and unto itself. My heart longs for a simpler time that no longer exists.
Well, I think I'm going to let that be the last word, Lawrence, because I think at the end of the day, the more complicated the issues are becoming, that means that we're never going to be seeing simpler times. Religion, faith, politics, trying to figure out how to peacefully coexist, maybe that may never truly happen. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. Did you know that there was a recent survey conducted by the Pew Research Center that found that while most Americans see religion as a good influence on society, over 80% of U.S. adults also say that religion's role in American society is shrinking?
Wow. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Oh my goodness. So Jennifer and I are in sync, because I'm also got a fact from Pew Research, and this is specifically about Minnesota. And, so we're describing the situation that occurred there, and we might think that this is a godless, secular society or state that we have here. But according to Pew, 74% of Minnesotans report that religion is either very important or somewhat important in their lives.
Oh, wow. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
We're going a different direction today, folks. Every spring, folks flock to Washington, D.C., to watch the cherry blossoms do their thing. And many have heard that the trees were a gift from Japan. But did you know that the trees did not initially come from Japan? When Japan colonized Korea, they took the cherry trees from Korea, and that's how they got established in Japan. So the trees that you see down in Washington, D.C. actually got their start in the land of the rising sun.
Oh, my goodness. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, as we wrap up, as we're shooting this current Supreme Court term, the 2023-2024, it has two distinct factors. One, it is one in which they have had the fewest number of cases that they've heard. And two, they have taken longer to get out their opinions than in almost any other term. So in other words, they're working less and they're working slower.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that information. Good being with you today. And thank you again for being with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.